We are back with the Sportsmemo College Football Every Game on the Board podcast, where we're going to be going from 303 down to 338 in terms of rotation numbers for the college football betting card with our guest today, Rob Veno. Follow him on Twitter at Rob Veno Sports. Robbie, welcome into the podcast. How are you?
I'm good today, Drew. How are you?
I'm doing good, bud. Excited to get your opinion on a lot of these college football games. Guys, we're going to have today's segment, and then we'll have two segments tomorrow finishing off the card. But we got, about 20 games here, starting on Thursday night, Robbie, with 303-304 Tulsa at Houston, an AAC matchup here. High total. It's at 70 right now at Bookmaker and Bet Online, and it looks like Houston, the Cougs, laying 17.5 or 18, depending what book you want to go by. But, Robbie, how would you look to bet Tulsa at Houston?
Well, I think the first thing is they're both off of a bye week, and maybe it was needed by both of these teams to have the bye land where it did. For Tulsa especially, Drew, because that's a team in flux right now. It looks as if we're going to get our first look at redshirt freshman Seth Boomer as the quarterback for Tulsa. Head coach Philip Montgomery not happy with the turnovers committed by the Golden Hurricanes so far. The season to date, through the first 4 games, has been somewhat of a disappointment for them. But when you look at the offensive numbers, the negative numbers, 14 sacks allowed so far this year, and then 13 turnovers to go with that. The turnovers are what they're trying to eliminate here. It's a tough decision from what I read for head coach Montgomery, because they really like Luke Skipper at quarterback, but the fact is they don't want to deal with shooting themselves in the foot much more. So, like I say, we're going to see a first-time quarterback in all likelihood tomorrow, Seth Boomer. This total that you mentioned rising up and over the 70 mark to 71, I think if you were just going to go what's been put on paper as far as results are concerned so far, you would think that's a little bit high, because Tulsa has been a better defensive team than offensive. And right now, Tulsa hasn't played a single game that's gone over the 70 mark this season. The highest they got to was 65 against FCS Central Arkansas, and then against FBS opponents, nothing over 50. This total is completely attributed to the Houston Cougars, both offensively and defensively. I think people look at the defensive pass yards allowed number and think that automatically Tulsa can come in and throw for yardage against them, and that might be the case. But Houston, obviously, when you play Texas Tech and give up 605 passing yards, your numbers are going to be skewed somewhat. I think Houston, right now rates as the better team, and that Kendall Briles offense is clicking on all cylinders as we speak. It's just not real sure what Seth Boomer is going to bring to the table as the quarterback of Tulsa, because in my opinion, they've got real good offensive parts around him and the capability to be a good offense. Philip Montgomery comes off that Baylor tree under Art Briles, and he loves to throw it around and score points. I think preseason people thought that was what was going to happen. It hasn't happened so far, but it could break loose at any point. Interesting game. Right now, I'm not committed to side or total in that one.
And guys, before we go too long, obviously if you're listening to the podcast, you're, I'm guessing either on iTunes or the new Sportsmemo website. Do want to let everybody know we did kind of upgrade everything, security, functionality. You'll see it a lot quicker. So if you have any kind of issues or anything, let us know. Just email in support@sportsmemo.com with any, suggestions, issues you're having, any clients out there with getting the plays or anything. But so far, it's been a pretty good transition from the old website that definitely needed upgraded to the new website. Shout out to our IT guy, Nick, also Johnny and Missy, just doing a great job helping me out and Robbie out, everybody out in the transition. But make sure to check out the new website, sportsmemo.com. And Robbie, we got another Thursday game here. This one's 7:30 Eastern time in the Sun Belt. Georgia State at Troy. Looks like 54.5 or 55 the total, and 14.5 or 15.5, depending where you're shopping, is what Troy is laying at home. You got anything on Georgia State at Troy here in the Sun Belt?
Yeah, but I think last week, Drew, was kind of either an awakening of the Georgia State football team or a mirage where Georgia State's concerned, because they absolutely mauled UL Monroe at more ways than one. It's not surprising to see a team score 46 against UL Monroe. What is a bit surprising is to see the Georgia State team run for 308 yards in that game. And then defensively, Georgia State holds Monroe to basically nothing on offense with Caleb Evans and company. They only gained 262 yards, scored 14 points. So I don't know what exactly to make of that game, but from what I read, I think it's going to be a little bit of a turnaround here toward the Georgia State side. I think they're better than what they showed their first 4 games of the season. Remember, they played some pretty tough opposition. Kennesaw State's an extremely good FCS team, top 10 for sure. NC State, obviously a solid club out of the ACC. Memphis, offensive-minded, and Western Michigan, offensive-minded. So last week's performance for Georgia State could be a bit of a buy signal. I think that money has shown that. The line has come down toward the Georgia State side here in this game. One thing to note about Troy, real quick here, is that, while I always consider them top of the heap defensively in the Sun Belt Conference, last week against true freshman Bryce Carpenter, who stepped in to play quarterback for Coastal Carolina, they allowed 18 of 22 for $172. Dan Ellington, a pretty steady quarterback for Georgia State. I think I agree with the line movement here towards the Georgia State side, even though it's on the road. I think this could be a pretty good Sun Belt battle.
Yeah, I could see that too. I mean, that you bring up that score against ULM. That was one of the more surprising scores of all of college football last week. I definitely didn't see that coming. Georgia State kind of came out of nowhere, and you brought up the offensive and defensive discrepancy. I'll tell you, the Georgia State scoring, I think we could all see that because ULM's defense isn't very good. But holding ULM to, 14 points you said, Robbie?
They did, yeah, and 262 total yards.
Yeah, definitely didn't see that one coming. So maybe this Georgia State defense is starting to get after it, and Troy is the next victim. I guess if you're betting the Panthers, they only have to stay within 2 touchdowns. That's definitely the side I'd lean in this one. Robbie, moving on to the Friday slate here, we got 307, 308, MTSU, that's Middle Tennessee, at Marshall. Looks like Marshall laying 6 at home, 52 the total, Robbie. MTSU came off a big win. You think they can continue it here?
Yeah, and it was a come-from-behind win, right? FAU, Florida Atlantic, was ahead for the majority of that contest, and then Middle Tennessee comes from behind late in that game and wins 25-24. That was an interesting one too, Drew, because we saw a massive move on the total in that game toward the under last week. It started early. It continued throughout the week. There was some buyback at the very end, but if I'm remembering right off the top of my head, that total started up at 68, got driven all the way down to 60, and then probably closed in the 61 vicinity. But the people who unloaded on under were exactly correct in that game, as it lands 49 total points. And you have to wonder, because when you just look at that matchup before that game started, you would think that those two would put together an offensive fireworks show. Didn't happen. Lane Kiffin has stressed all season long about the tackling of his football team, and they've tried to get that defense to be better. Last week they were better. Not good enough to win, but they were better against Middle Tennessee. I think what I see out of MTSU right now, Drew, is we're very used to Brent Stockstill leading an explosive style offense. And to me, after watching that team through the first few weeks here, and I thought that a lot of it only had to do with the fact that they played extremely difficult defenses from the SEC in Vanderbilt and Georgia. So I was attributing a lot of their lack of explosiveness to those two defenses. But last week, I think we can tell now that this is not the MTSU offense that we've seen the last couple of years. It's very much more dink and dunk, very much more methodical down the field. Even though their tempo is good, the chunks of yardage that they attempt to get at a time are much smaller than what they used to be able to get. So Middle Tennessee trending more towards a lower scoring team, and subsequently we see the move on the under here. Small, but still a move from 53 down to 52. Little money on MTSU as well. I kind of rate these teams as about the same thing, although I wait for the explosiveness of this Marshall passing game to take place. New offensive coordinator there to start the season said they were going to attack more downfield. I'm interested to see if Conference USA season, the heart of it, is when this begins. Last week against Western Kentucky, they weren't exactly explosive, but Marshall averaging still about 277 yards through the air. A tough game for me to play a side on. I think I might get to the total in this game as far as an over is concerned, just because I believe that Marshall has that explosiveness in them. And the play calling, you have to have a play caller who's willing to go downfield, and I think Marshall's got that right now.
We got 309-310 Georgia Tech at Louisville. Looks like Tech laying 4.5 on the road, 57.5 the total. Robbie, I'll tell you, this number looks a little short. How would you look to bet the Jackets and Cardinals?
Yeah, I have to agree with you, Drew, only because we've seen enough of Louisville to know now that Bobby Petrino's got his hands full with his, what's near and dear to his heart, and that's offense. They just cannot move the football. Now, last week, they had Florida State mid-fourth quarter, maybe even toward the late end of the fourth quarter. They were still winning. FSU comes from behind and gets a 28-21 win. But again, Louisville just struggles to move the football. They've been better defensively. I mean, they are a defensive team this year. If you want to just say what is their anchor or the better part of their team would be the defense right now. Offense has gone through quarterbacks, Juwan pass in, Juwan pass out, backup quarterbacks in, backup quarterbacks out. It's been an interesting 4 games so far for the Louisville Cardinal. They have to defend this triple option. Now, I'll say this. Power ratings made the game Georgia Tech only 1.5 on the road. Georgia Tech had been no great shakes until they absolutely destroyed Bowling Green last week. Bowling Green is a sieve of a defense, so you have to take that with a grain of salt. We'll see what happens here. You're looking for progression out of Louisville, Drew, and maybe we saw some of it last week, but I just don't like the way the offense is going right now. If I were to play it, I'd probably look toward the under in that game. Louisville's D, it's assignment football, but maybe they're good enough to keep Georgia Tech contained enough to keep that thing under 57.5.
We got 311-312 Utah State at BYU. Looks like BYU laying 2.5 at home, 55 the total. You got anything on the Friday nightcap, Robbie?
BYU's offense, let's face it, they fired Ty Detmer because it was prehistoric in its ways, and head coach Sataki couldn't take it anymore. He fires him. He brings in Jeff Grimes, LSU offensive line coach, a respected offensive line coach, and a guy who was in his first term ever as a game day play caller and as an offensive coordinator. The BYU offensive numbers don't look good, and they're taking a lot of heat for it right now, Drew, but I would say this. They played some tough competition, and Justin Wilcox's defense at California is pretty good. Wisconsin's is elite. Washington's is elite. Those are 3 of their opponents so far this season, playing a very difficult start to the season. They're going to get Utah State now, whose defensive numbers look really good, but they've been untested. I think, the clash between those two, BYU somewhat sad-looking offensive numbers, Utah State's very good-looking defensive numbers, that might change tomorrow night. BYU's going to get an opponent where they can potentially move the football. All that being said, if you watch Utah State right now, I don't know how you play against them at this point in time. Jordan Love throwing the football all over the field. The pace with which they play at is insane. I would venture to say, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it feels like they go faster than any team goes in college football right now, and that would include Lincoln Riley at Oklahoma or any of the extreme tempo teams. This team really goes almost every 12, 14 seconds. Receivers are great, Tarver and Raymond. I think you might see a higher scoring game. That total obviously is based on averages between the two teams, and I don't know that averages are going to hold up tomorrow in this game. I think BYU's played a more difficult schedule than people give them credit for, and Utah State, the way they move the ball and at that pace, they can put up points on anybody.
That's the Thursday and Friday games. We got the Saturday games up next, and before we get there, got to give you a shout-out, Robbie. This year, college football, 62% plus 15 units already. And guys, that's on a 1 and 2 unit scale. No 10 unit plays or anything like that. So he's already up 15 units for his clients. $100 better is up, $1,500 betting Rob Veno's service. Hats off to you, Robbie. Just real quick, are you doing anything different? I mean, you've always been a successful handicapper, but,